In an apartment in the Christian quarter of Beirut, two men are seated. They are high-ranking British intelligence officers. Both have served for nearly 30 years. They have known each other so long that they can hardly remember when they became best friends. However, what might seem like a heartfelt conversation is actually a covert operation. Behind the wall, British intelligence officers are secretly recording the conversation of the two men. For one of them has been working for Soviet intelligence for 30 years. He is the most successful spy in the entire history of the KGB. The main battles of the Cold War took place out of public view. The key players were intelligence officers. The main weapon was information. Intelligence services of different countries tried to infiltrate their agents into the power structures of the adversary. The higher the position of the spy, the more valuable his information. Most such operations ended in nothing, but some resulted in resounding success. The Soviet Union probably held primacy in this competition. For 30 years, the KGB operated a network of spies on British territory. All of them were members of the elite and held important positions in intelligence services and government administration. The operation went down in history under the name the Cambridge Five. In any good story, there is a main character, and this is no exception. How did the Soviet Union manage to infiltrate an agent into the highest echelons of British intelligence, and how was he able to pass the main secrets of Western intelligence to the KGB for almost 30 years? This is the story of Kim Philby. World War II could have ended just as it began. The fate of the main military conflict in history was decided in the town of Venlo, on the border between Holland and Germany. A few members of the British intelligence service were waiting to meet a group of German officers planning to overthrow Hitler. A cafe right at the border with Germany was chosen as the meeting place. This meeting was supposed to be the triumph of the British intelligence officers. Unfortunately, they did not know that the German general, allegedly leading the resistance, was none other than Walter Schellenberg, the head of the Nazi Germany intelligence service. And the upcoming meeting was an elaborate trap. The event became known in history as the Venlo incident. During the operation, 2 British intelligence officers were captured by the Germans and a Dutch officer was killed. At that time, the Netherlands was officially maintaining neutrality in the war. However, the involvement of their officer in the incident was evident, and 2 weeks later, Hitler used it as a pretext to invade the country. The failure of British intelligence became a significant event not only for world history, but also for the young intelligence officer Nicholas Elliot. He was only 22, and these were his first months working for the British Secret Service MI6. Elliot was serving in the Dutch Bureau, and one of the British officers captured in Venlo was his immediate superior. Nicholas quickly learned that deception and disinformation were among a spy's principal tools. Immediately following Hitler's invasion of the Netherlands, Elliot was urgently transferred to London and soon appointed to the counterintelligence department. It was there that he met another young employee whom he considered his best friend for the next 20 years, until it was discovered that all this time he had been a Soviet spy. Kim Philby secured a position in MI6 at just the right time. With the war beginning, the British Foreign Intelligence Service was undergoing transformation. The working conditions were changing, methods were evolving, and consequently, the personnel were changing as well. The leadership was actively recruiting young, educated, energetic employees who represented the elite of British society. The main word people used to describe Kim Philby was charm, impeccable manners, attention to others, and an excellent sense of humour. He always remembered the names of his interlocutors' children, inquired about how a colleague's mother or wife was doing if he knew they were unwell, and was always ready to offer a drink, enjoying one himself. He was not yet 30, and legends about Kim Philby were already circulating. A few years before, he had worked as a correspondent covering the Spanish Civil War. Philby miraculously survived when a shell exploded near the car where he was eating chocolate with cognac. 3 other passengers were killed, while Kim escaped with a minor injury. Philby was a decent journalist. His articles were published by leading British newspapers, including The Times, but the young man's ambitions went much further. He planned to become a secret agent. MI5 and MI6 represented two wings of the British Security Service. The former was responsible for maintaining order within the country, including combating foreign spies. MI6 operated abroad, conducting intelligence activities in the interests of the kingdom. There was another less formal distinction between the two departments of the security service. MI5 primarily employed former police officers and military personnel, whereas many MI6 employees came from the British elite, people from respectable families with impressive educations. MI6 did not advertise vacancies, and people did not just walk in off the street. In this regard, Kim Philby was fortunate. He came from that very narrow upper-crust class where connections meant everything, and everyone had them. The young man only needed to hint to his acquaintances that he was interested in intelligence work, and the wheels of recruitment immediately began to turn. Eventually, it turned out that the deputy head of MI6 knew Philby's father, who was a significant figure in British society, and gave his son an excellent recommendation. Thus, young Philby became an employee of the Secret Service in the United Kingdom. A few dozen people worked in the large mansion in the suburbs of London. People living in the area believed it to be a branch of the British Museum, and its staff to be young archaeologists. In reality, the building housed officers and personnel of the 5th section of the MI6 Secret Service. The main task of the department's employees was counterintelligence. They gathered information abroad about operations planned by foreign intelligence services against the United Kingdom. In the 5th section, Kim Philby headed the Spain and Portugal Bureau, a very responsible position for a novice employee. The two sides of the Iberian Peninsula maintained neutrality in the war that had begun, and thus they became one of the main hubs of attraction for intelligence operatives from various sides of the front. Consequently, Kim Philby had access to a great deal of important secret information. Despite the responsibility of his work, the 5th section was a bustling place. Employees, many of whom were indecently young, closely interacted with each other, spent their free time together, started romances with their assistants, and drank heavily. One of the reasons for the close interaction among colleagues was shared secrets. Wives, parents and friends outside the Secret Service were unaware of their real work, so colleagues were the only ones with whom they could discuss their clandestine craft. Employees of the 5th section often travelled to London, where they met with workers from other intelligence departments or civil servants and, of course, visited their gentlemen's clubs, which were an integral part of the life of the British elite men. Therefore, when one morning Kim Philby boarded a train to the capital, holding a work briefcase, no one suspected anything. Inside the case was detailed information about the work of the 5th section, its employees' past and planned operations, and other secret data. After completing his business meetings in London, Philby descended into the subway. He let the first train go by. When the second train arrived, Philby waited for everyone to board and jumped in at the very last moment before the doors closed. After 2 stations, he got off and took a train in the opposite direction. Philby then travelled a few stops by bus, and after making sure he was not being followed, went to a park where a sturdy man waited for him on a bench. They shook hands. Philby handed over the contents of his briefcase and went home to the countryside. The man on the bench was an employee of the Soviet Secret Service, NKVD, the very organization for which Kim Philby had secretly been working for 8 years. All the circumstances of Kim Philby's life pointed to him becoming anything but a Soviet spy. Philby Sr., a researcher, intellectual writer, and a notable figure in high society. While he was a civil servant in the British colony in India, his son, Harold Adrian Russell, was born. His father, and thereafter everyone else, called the boy by the name of a Kipling character, Kim. After graduating from private school, young Philby entered one of the country's best universities, Cambridge. The young man followed the typical path of a representative of the British elite. It was expected that in the future he would occupy a good position in the country's leadership, gain membership in exclusive clubs, and become a worthy representative of the upper class. In short, he would be as British as it was possible to be. However, during his studies at the university, Kim Philby became acquainted with communist ideas, and this changed his life. Cambridge of the 1930s presented a wide variety of ideological movements among both students and faculty. Against the backdrop of the rise of fascism in Europe, many perceived communism as the only worthy alternative. Philby joined the Cambridge Socialist Society. Leftist ideas gradually took root in the student's mind, but the real turning point was his trip to Berlin in 1933. There, he witnessed the rise of Nazism and the persecution of Jews firsthand. After this, Kim became firmly convinced that capitalist countries were weak and thus susceptible to fascist influences. The only real opponents of the far right were the communists, especially the Soviet Union. Philby spent the gift money he received for graduating from university on the complete works of Marx. It is uncertain whether he studied these works in detail or even read them. Philby was among those who sincerely believed in the idea without being a radical. In the year 1933, Vienna was one of the epicenters of left-right confrontation. Philby went to the Austrian capital, ostensibly to improve his German, before securing a job at the Foreign Office. In reality, the young man intended to engage in the work of the leftist underground. In Vienna, Kim Philby met another resistance member, Litzi Coleman. For the young, inexperienced man, she became an ideological mentor, his first sexual partner, and ultimately his wife. Soon, the ultra-right Austrian authorities suppressed their political opponents, and Kim and Litzi returned to London. There, at his wife's suggestion, Philby met a man named Otto, short, just over 30, with a strong Eastern European accent. Philby learned Otto's real name only decades later. It was Arnold Deutsch. A Czech Jew, Deutsch was working for the USSR and was the future architect of the most successful operation in the history of Soviet intelligence known as the Cambridge Five. Officially, Arnold Deutsch continued his chemical education in London. His close relative was a very successful British businessman, the founder of a large chain of Odeon cinemas. Thus, while one brother thrived in the capitalist arena, the other was trying to dismantle it. Arnold Deutsch's main task for Soviet intelligence was the recruitment of leftist students from leading British universities. The ingenuity of this scheme cannot be denied. In the class-based British society, the best universities mostly admitted the offspring of the elite, who would later become an integral part of that same elite and occupy top positions in government administration, diplomacy, or secret services. Thus, with favourable circumstances, within a few decades, it was possible to groom a spy to the highest echelons of power. Kim Philby, to some extent, was the ideal candidate for the position of a Soviet agent, ambitious, educated and well-connected, loyal to communist ideals, though not so much as to broadcast it to everyone. A fairly small circle knew of his true beliefs. When Deutsch suggested to the young man that he become a Soviet agent, he agreed without hesitation. "My future looks romantic," wrote Kim Philby at that time. Deutsch reported the new recruit to the head of the NKVD residency in London, and Kim Philby was given the code name Sonny. Successful espionage always involves diversion. For Kim Philby to become an effective Soviet agent, he first needed to make a complete turnaround and become overtly anti-Soviet. In the mid-1930s, friends from Cambridge, who knew about Philby's communist leanings, noticed a strange transformation. He suddenly began to sympathize with the Nazis. This was recommended by Arnold Deutsch. On his advice, the young spy chose journalism as the beginning of his professional path. With this experience, he could then move into diplomacy and intelligence. Thanks to connections, Philby quickly found work in a publication partially funded by the Nazi government and even joined the Anglo-German Fellowship. All of this not only allowed Philby to make a public switch of loyalty, but also gave him access to information on Britain's relations with Nazi Germany, which he leaked to his Soviet handlers. Some of Philby's friends, seeing his sympathies towards the new German regime, simply turned away. However, this did not stop the young man, as he had something greater, a mission. Philby passed on to his Soviet handlers a list of potential candidates for recruitment into the ranks of spies. Among them were many former friends and acquaintances from Cambridge, including Donald Maclean and Guy Burgess. Maclean had long been a committed communist. After university, he secured a position at the Foreign Office. Having agreed to become a Soviet agent, Maclean, like Philby, began actively covering his tracks from the past and now posed as a supporter of right-wing ideas. Guy Burgess, like his friends from Cambridge, was a smart young man. Despite being temperamental and extravagant, he was also invited to join the company of Soviet agents. A little later, Burgess recruited another former Cambridge student, Anthony Blunt, who also had good prospects of entering the intelligence services. Thus, Arnold Deutsch created a genuine spy network consisting of graduates from Cambridge University. Almost all participants hailed from the elite. They had great professional prospects, which made them of high value to Soviet intelligence. The first handler assigned to Kim Philby was a man named Theodore Marley. A former Hungarian monk, he first became disillusioned with one faith and then found another by joining the Bolsheviks. After undergoing special training, he was sent to London to oversee Soviet spies. It was Marley who met with Philby to receive information, convey orders from Moscow, and handle other routine espionage tasks. In 1936, the Soviet leadership decided to send Philby to Spain. There was a civil war unfolding between the Soviet-supported leftist Republicans and the right-wing nationalists led by General Franco. Kim Philby, posing as a freelance journalist, went to work on the side of the right-wing nationalists. In addition to his primary job, he actively gathered intelligence on the armaments and plans of the nationalists and relayed it to Moscow. At one point, the Soviet leadership considered the idea of assassinating the dissenting General Franco. The executioner was to be none other than Kim Philby. The handler of the spy, Theodore Marley, opposed this plan. He assured that the chances of the operation's success were slim and not worth the loss of the agent. Instead, Philby continued his intelligence work, miraculously surviving a shell explosion near his car and even receiving a medal from the very General Franco, who, of course, did not know he was rewarding his potential assassin. 3 years later, the war in Spain ended with the victory of the nationalists. Philby returned to London, then worked briefly as a journalist in France and was ready to move to the next level. At that time, Kim Philby did not know that the Soviet leadership had already been swept up in a wave of deadly paranoia. The Stalinist purges affected, among others, people Philby was acquainted with. Theodore Marley was urgently summoned to Moscow. Being of foreign origin with a church background made him one of the first candidates suspected of treason. After interrogations and torture in a cell on Lubyanka, he allegedly confessed to working for German intelligence and was executed. The same fate befell the officer who supervised the Cambridge spies after Arnold Deutsch, Philby's handler in Paris, and the successor of Philby's handler in Paris. The fate of Deutsch himself remains shrouded in mystery. According to official data, the architect of the Cambridge Five spent several years in Moscow after working in London and was then sent to South America, where he was to undertake another mission. On the way, the ship with Deutsch on board was sunk by the Germans. At the same time, facts exist that contradict this story. Considering Marley's fate and others, it would not be a stretch to assume that the Czech Jew Deutsch, who lived his entire life in Europe, was an obvious candidate for the Stalinist purges. Philby learned about the tragic fate of his handlers from the 1930s much later. He expressed no regrets about it. Among the young people joining MI6, some were driven by a strong sense of patriotism. Others were motivated by a thirst for adventure and romance. Kim Philby's future best friend, Nicholas Elliott, belonged to the latter group. For Kim Philby himself, joining MI6 was a calculated move, another step on the career path of a Soviet agent. Shortly before that, MI5 issued a report stating that the Soviet Union was not conducting any espionage activities on British soil. This data could hardly be further from the truth. Soviet services were very actively engaged in the kingdom's territory and did so quite successfully. to such an extent that their agents already held positions within the country's secret services. A representative of the Cambridge 5 Blunt began working in MI5 while his colleague in the spy network, Purges, had been serving in MI6 for several years and was among those who eventually helped his friend Kim Philby secure a position. The British authorities' misconceptions about Soviet spies were caused by several factors. Firstly, it was hard to imagine that individuals from the elite with excellent education and prospects would start spying for Moscow. Secondly, at that time, London had other priorities. World War II was escalating, and the British were primarily concerned with their main adversary, Germany. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, was transitioning into the position of an ally. London shared intelligence with Moscow to combat Hitler, but did so rather sparingly. Agent Sonny passed on to his handlers information that his bosses would never have provided to Moscow: secret operations, the structure of intelligence, and the identities of agents. Philby also provided the USSR with detailed information about his colleagues working in the 5th Department, including about his best friend Nicholas Elliott, whom he repeatedly referred to as unsightly in his report for Moscow. Philby even passed on an extensive profile of his new wife, with whom he already had children. Despite all this, Sonny, like his colleagues in the Cambridge network, still raised suspicions from Moscow's side. The Soviet secret services received invaluable confidential information from their agents in London. However, in an atmosphere of total distrust and paranoia, many in the NKVD viewed their work with suspicion. In Moscow, it was believed that infiltrating the British secret services was nearly impossible. Yet it turned out that several agents not only succeeded in doing so, but also supplied them with a wealth of secret data. Soviet intelligence officer Yuri Modin, who later became the handler of the Cambridge network, once said the following about Philby: "He was physically and mentally a complete British intelligence officer. I could never fully believe he was one of us." In Moscow, it was believed that Philby and his friends might actually be double agents, spreading disinformation in the interests of British intelligence. To dispel doubts, Agent Sonny was entrusted with a responsible task. He was required to provide a full list of names of British agents working on the territory of the Union. Several years prior, a high-ranking NKVD officer, Walter Krivitsky, had defected to Western intelligence services. Thanks to his information, a member of the British Foreign Ministry who secretly worked for Moscow and was one of Kim Philby's instructors in the mid-1930s, was apprehended. Krivitsky also told of a Soviet agent operating under the guise of a journalist during the Spanish Civil War. The defector did not know his name. At the time, no one paid adequate attention to this information. However, it meant that Philby's espionage work was under constant threat, and now he faced a task that could easily end in disaster. By law, a British intelligence officer caught in treason could be executed. The archive, containing records of all MI6 operations, was located next to the building of the 5th section. Philby knew the head of the archive, and from the moment he received the assignment from Moscow, he began to regularly invite him for drinks. Some time and many cocktails later, Philby requested access to documents on Soviet operations. This fact alone could raise serious suspicion. Philby's area of responsibility in the 5th section was Spain and Portugal. Why would he need data on the USSR? Nevertheless, thanks to the relationship he built with the archive's head, Philby obtained access without any questions. He copied the data and passed it to Moscow. In the USSR, they were disappointed with the information from Agent Sonia. According to his data, it appeared that Britain did not have a single spy on Soviet territory, except for a couple of minor informants who had no access to significant sources. This strengthened the belief among many in Moscow that Philby might be a double agent. The NKVD decided to continue its cooperation with the Cambridge 5, but with great caution. Nicholas Elliott received an important promotion. He became the head of the MI6 station in Istanbul. Turkey, which maintained neutrality in the war, was one of the main espionage centers. The Germans and Allies used the country to prepare and send spies into enemy territory. Thus, Elliot had access to a large amount of secrets, and Nicholas shared these secrets with his best friend Kim Philby. The Abwehr was the powerful intelligence service of Nazi Germany. The assistant to the head of the Abwehr in Turkey was a young German named Erich Vermehren. Secretly, he was a very religious person and a participant in the underground anti-Hitler resistance. Vermehren approached representatives of British intelligence and offered cooperation. The operation was overseen by the MI6 station head in Turkey, Nicholas Elliot. Given the concentration of spies in Istanbul, it was obvious that information about Vermehren's cooperation would sooner or later reach the Germans. MI6 immediately prepared an emergency evacuation plan for the defector to be activated at the first sign of danger. In a short time, Vermehren managed to pass on many details about the activities of German intelligence to the British. After MI6 received information that the Abwehr was preparing to arrest the spy, he and his wife were urgently taken to London. Kim Philby kindly suggested to Elliot that Vermehren could stay at his mother's apartment for a while. It was there that the intelligence officers held several more discussions with the defector and learned much interesting information. For instance, about the underground anti-Hitler network of German conservatives. These people intended to take power into their own hands after the end of the war and the fall of the Nazis. The British, of course, did not share this data with the Soviet Union. This was done for them by Kim Philby. At the end of the war, when Soviet forces entered East German territory, potential resistance in the form of German conservatives was swiftly and precisely suppressed thanks to information from Agent Sonny. By the end of the year 1944, when it became evident that the war was nearing its conclusion, the priorities in the leadership of British intelligence services began to change. The threat of espionage from the Soviet Union was coming to the forefront. Kim Philby realized that this shift in paradigm opened up new possibilities. He proposed to his superiors the idea of creating Section 9 within MI6. According to the plan, this section was to deal with covert operations related to the USSR and its communist allies. The leadership liked the idea, and a former boss of Philby in the 5th section was appointed head of the newly created department. Agent Sonny received instructions from Moscow to ensure that the position of head of the Soviet direction went to him. Philby carried out the operation with surgical precision. Thanks to his machinations, a conflict arose between the new head of Section 9 and another high-ranking MI6 official, and a few months later, the position of head of the Soviet division became vacant. Philby was offered the position, which he accepted with honor. Thus, it was not just that the fox was left to guard the henhouse, but he was entrusted with its construction and oversight. This was an incredible success for Soviet intelligence services. Now, information about all Soviet-related operations from Britain, as well as what Britain knew about Moscow's operations, would be immediately known to the Soviet intelligence services. Towards the end of the war, it became evident that Philby and other spies of the Cambridge Five were worthy of full trust from Soviet intelligence. Not only did they work solely out of ideological conviction, without monetary compensation, but their accomplishments were notably impressive. Over the years, Philby alone provided Moscow with data on the Manhattan Project, the military plans of the Allies regarding Germany, secret American operations in Italy, MI6 actions in the Middle East, and this is by no means the entire list. All information from Philby was ultimately true. From the London NKVD headquarters during the war, nearly 10,000 military, political and economic documents of Britain were sent to Moscow. The leadership of Soviet intelligence understood that Kim Philby played an increasingly important role for them. One indicator of this was the change in his code name. Thus, Philby became known as Agent Stanley. At the same time, Philby's staggering success posed an intriguing problem for him. If all British operations against the USSR were to fail, it might seem highly suspicious. Conversely, if they were to succeed, it would not be welcome in Moscow. The same issue concerned the staff of the new Soviet division. If they worked poorly, it would reflect on his position in MI6. If they worked well, they might eventually discover that the chief Soviet spy was their boss. However, at that moment, this was not what troubled Philby the most. What truly concerned Agent Stanley were the increasing cases of defectors who had served in the Soviet intelligence services. By the end of the year 1944, Kim Philby was closer to being compromised than ever before. Konstantin Volkov worked at the Soviet embassy in Turkey and had reached out to a British diplomat. During the meeting, Volkov revealed that his official position was merely a cover. In reality, he was the deputy head of Soviet intelligence in Turkey, and before receiving this assignment, he worked in Moscow, focusing on British affairs. Volkov's proposal was simple. He and his wife would be helped to flee to the West in exchange for him providing MI6 with invaluable secret information, including lists of all NKVD agents in Turkey and Britain, totaling nearly 500 individuals. All the documents were kept in an empty apartment in Moscow, and once Volkov and his wife were safely in Britain, he would provide MI6 with the address so that they could retrieve the data with the help of diplomats. To prove his credibility, Volkov disclosed a small piece of information. He claimed that a Soviet spy held a high position within British counterintelligence. Soon, a report concerning the potential Soviet defector was on the desk of the MI6 chief, who urgently summoned the head of the Soviet counterintelligence section, Philby, and handed him the report. As Philby read the document, he was overcome with dread. Volkov did not know the name of the Soviet spy within British counterintelligence, but there was no doubt that the documents he promised to hand over would easily lead to Philby. The defector's information also contained hints about other members of the Cambridge Five. Kim Philby urgently arranged a meeting with his Soviet handler and shared the details about Volkov's impending escape. The NKVD officer tried to reassure Agent Stanley, saying they would attempt to manage the situation. That same evening, the British intercepted but could not decipher an active radio transmission between London and Moscow. Philby needed to act quickly. He convinced his superior that someone should handle the Volkov matter on site in Istanbul, and that the head of the 9th Soviet section of MI6 was the best candidate. Upon Philby's arrival in Turkey, an operation to exfiltrate Konstantin Volkov to London commenced. However, when the British tried to contact him, the Soviet diplomat did not answer the phone, and he did not respond to any repeated calls. Inwardly, Philby felt jubilant. He knew that shortly before, representatives of the Soviet intelligence services had abducted Konstantin Volkov and his wife and taken them to Moscow. During interrogation, he confessed his intention to betray information and flee to Britain. Thereafter, Volkov and his wife were executed. Upon returning to London, Philby offered several plausible explanations to his superiors, ranging from the possibility that Volkov's phone might have been tapped by his own people to him drunkenly blurting out too much to someone. The MI6 leadership was satisfied with these explanations. Thanks to his new position and the assistance of other members of the Cambridge Five, Philby controlled all information on Britain's operations against the USSR. He could not only inform Moscow about upcoming operations, but also explain how MI6 was thinking regarding the main adversary in the unfolding Cold War. Stanley was an extremely valuable asset. 11 years of impeccable service was proof of his loyalty. We must protect him from being exposed. This is what Philby's handler in London wrote to Moscow. Spies love receiving awards they cannot show anyone. Philby was awarded the Order of the British Empire for his work during the Second World War. 2 months earlier, Moscow had secretly decorated him with the Order of the Red Banner for his espionage activities benefiting the USSR. Having both these awards simultaneously made Philby a unique spy in history, but most importantly, his career in British intelligence was actively advancing. Some colleagues noted that Philby was one of the main candidates to lead the MI6 Foreign Intelligence Service in the future. Inside Kim Philby resided several personas. One served MI6 and worked for the good of Britain, while the other was a Soviet spy. In such a situation, it is crucial to have a clear set of values to avoid confusion with changing circumstances. From the time of his recruitment in the 1930s and until the end of the war, one of his main motivations was the fight against fascist Germany. Thus, by leaking information to the USSR, he was fighting Hitler. Moreover, Britain and the Soviet Union were long on the same side. However, after the war ended, the balance of power shifted. The USSR became a competitor, and it turned out that Philby was now working for an outright enemy. Yet, this did not shake Agent Stanley's beliefs. He remained devoted to Soviet ideals and was willing to move forward. Now, as Philby's career in MI6 was on the rise, he needed to bury some skeletons from his past. When he announced he was going to marry, it came as a surprise even to his closest friends. Kim and Aileen had been living together for more than 5 years and had 3 children. But, to everyone's surprise, it turned out they were not yet married. The real reason for this was simple. Philby was still not officially divorced from his first wife and communist associate, Litzy. Thus, Kim urgently arranged a divorce and formalized a marriage with Aileen. Philby often left the house without warning and disappeared for days. Or he would lock himself in the basement and spend hours there. Aileen suspected he was hiding something, possibly infidelities, perhaps something else. Naturally, she did not know about her husband's espionage for the USSR, or even about his work with MI6. Kim told her he was an employee of the Foreign Office. A significant step in advancing within MI6 was overseas experience. Philby had spent all his years of service in a building in the suburbs of London. Therefore, when his superiors offered him to head the MI6 division in Turkey, he immediately accepted. After the war ended in 1945, Turkey did not lose its importance for the intelligence services of various countries. From here, the West tried to deploy spies into the USSR's territory, while the USSR did the same toward the West. During the following 2 years of service in Turkey, Philby was mainly involved in preparing such operations. MI6 believed that in the territories of Armenia and Georgia, there were strong anti-Soviet sentiments and a foundation for regime change. The British intelligence services recruited a group of agents from Georgian émigrés in Europe and prepared them for infiltration. The plan was for them to cross the Turkish border into Georgia and establish contacts with anti-Soviet circles within the Republic. Needless to say, the operation failed spectacularly. Immediately after crossing the border, the saboteurs were caught by Soviet military forces. Philby had previously passed all the detailed plans of the operation to Moscow. Despite the difficulty in calling Philby's 2 years of work in Turkey evidently successful, he soon received another promotion. He was appointed as the head of the American section of MI6 in Washington. For Agent Stanley and his curators in Moscow, this was another victory. A few years prior, a new secret service, the CIA, had been established in the United States. Thanks to the close cooperation between the 2 main Western intelligence agencies, Philby now gained access to American operations against the USSR. However, on the eve of his trip to Washington, Agent Stanley's mood was far from joyful. The Americans had passed important information to their allies in MI6. Since the early 1940s, US intelligence agencies had intercepted a vast amount of Soviet secret communications. They were all encoded, and for a long time the Americans were unable to understand the content. However, gradually, they deciphered the Soviet code and decrypted more and more messages. Thus, the CIA learned that Soviet spies were embedded within the British government. Specifically, it was discovered that an agent under the codename Homer had been leaking secrets from the British Embassy in Washington to Moscow in the mid-1940s. The CIA had not yet disclosed the name of the spy, but Kim Philby didn't need them to. He knew very well that his friend and fellow member of the Cambridge Five, Donald Maclean, worked as a secretary at the embassy in Washington in the mid-1940s. Thus, a new serious threat loomed over Philby. The new head of the MI6 bureau in Washington quickly settled into his workplace. Philby always knew how to build relationships with the right people. He attended the places where intelligence officers often gathered, drank heavily, and socialized. During conversations, some secrets slipped from tongues, and Philby memorized them well. In the United States, building connections was further eased by the fact that the new head of MI6 in America not only knew some of the personnel, but had been friends with them for a long time. During the war, the Americans actively sent their agents to train with British intelligence, and now these people held significant positions, including in the CIA. Thus, Philby was friends with the families of some Central Intelligence Agency employees and frequently visited their offices, where he took an interest in the details of their work. At that time, nobody found his curiosity suspicious, associating it solely with the professional work of an MI6 officer and not with the fact that he was a Soviet spy. Kim Philby learned details about a large network of anti-Soviet spies in Germany, as well as CIA and MI6 operations to infiltrate agents into Albania, Armenia, Georgia, Latvia, and other Soviet Union allied republics or countries. Thus, almost every attempt by Western intelligence services to send spies from outside ended in failure, with agents simply disappearing as they were immediately intercepted by Soviet military on Philby's tip-off. Within the CIA and MI6, it was understood that there was likely a leak somewhere, but they did not know precisely where, and they merely blamed each other. In the year 1950, Kim Philby turned 38. Many of his friends noticed he looked older. Naturally, the amount of alcohol couldn't go unnoticed. Philby drank a lot at work, meeting with necessary people, and continued drinking in his spare time. Kim was a prime example of a highly productive alcoholic. Alcohol visibly affected his appearance, but not yet his work results. Another factor contributing to premature aging was undoubtedly stress. The CIA continued successfully decrypting Soviet messages. For instance, they uncovered a whole network of Soviet agents operating in Britain in the mid-1940s, and one particularly valuable agent with the codename Stanley. Philby realized that the noose was tightening around him. The Americans also continued their investigations into the agent Homer, who was Donald McLean. McLean managed to evade suspicions, partly due to the status of his father, who had once been a member of the country's cabinet. However, it was evident that this protection wouldn't last forever. Philby understood that as soon as McLean was exposed, the trail would eventually lead to him. At the beginning of 1951, the Americans achieved another breakthrough. They decrypted another Soviet message concerning the agent Homer. It revealed that in the year 1944, when the spy worked at the British Embassy in Washington, he had a pregnant wife. The only such employee was Donald McLean. The news quickly spread through British intelligence circles and reached Philby. Once again, he was dangerously close to exposure. Donald McLean headed the American department at the British Foreign Office in London. He didn't yet know that MI5 had already placed him under surveillance. The intelligence services decided not to arrest McLean immediately. The technology through which the Americans decrypted the Soviet message was still secret, and its data couldn't be used in court. Therefore, MI5 decided to catch McLean at a meeting with his Soviet handlers and use this as evidence. When Kim Philby learned of his colleague's exposure, he immediately passed the information to Moscow, and they began preparing an urgent exfiltration plan for the agent. However, someone first needed to inform McLean that he had been exposed. Given the surveillance, this couldn't be done by his Soviet handler. By a fortunate coincidence, another member of the Cambridge Five, Guy Burgess, was at the time working at the British Embassy in Washington. If he travelled to London and met there with the head of the American Department of the Foreign Office, it would raise no suspicions. Thus, Philby passed information to Burgess for McLean. Kim Philby had known Burgess for a long time and knew him well. They were friends, moreover. They were united by espionage on behalf of the USSR. Burgess was an intelligent man and could, essentially, put two and two together. If McLean was compromised, then they would eventually come for Burgess as well. Nevertheless, Philby fervently asked his friend not to flee with McLean, as in that case, Kim's own chances would be non-existent, given that his connections with both were obvious and his exposure would happen swiftly. Burgess assured Philby that he had no desire to flee to the USSR. After Burgess arrived in London, the operation commenced. Friday, the 25th of May, was McLean's birthday. He and Burgess bought 2 round-trip cruise tickets to France for the weekend to avoid arousing suspicion. The men arrived at the port just a few minutes before the ship's departure. En route, the ship made a brief stop in the small French town of Saint-Malo. 2 hours later, the vessel continued its journey, but with 2 fewer passengers on board. Burgess and McLean took a taxi to the town of Rennes. There, they caught a train to Paris, where they transferred to a train bound for Bern, Switzerland. There, they headed to the Soviet embassy. A few hours later, Burgess and McLean exited the building with passports under different names. They purchased plane tickets to Stockholm with a layover in Prague. In the Czech capital, the spies left the airport and got into a waiting car. The mission was accomplished. They were on the other side of the Iron Curtain. By Monday morning after the weekend, Michigan, 5 officials realized that McLean and Burgess were missing. They immediately sent messages to branches of the British intelligence service across Europe and issued special instructions to monitor Soviet embassies. By this time, Burgess and McLean were already in Moscow. A day later, the news of the disappearance of the 2 Cambridge 5 colleagues reached Philby. He immediately went home, gathered a camera and other photographic equipment provided to him by Soviet handlers, and buried them in the forest. The Soviet spy understood that if there was ever a right time to defect to the USSR, it was now. However, he ultimately decided to remain. There were several significant arguments against Philby's fleeing: his friendship with Burgess and McLean, whom he had known since university, his youthful infatuation with communism, the mysterious disappearance of Soviet defector Volkov in Turkey, the decrypted message with the agent's codename Stanley, and the testimony of defector Kravitsky about a journalist spy during the Spanish War. However, the Americans still did not know who was hiding under the name Stanley, and all the other arguments were circumstantial and insufficiently substantial. Kim Philby decided that he would manage to emerge unscathed. A few weeks after the escape of McLean and Burgess, Philby was summoned to London. Theoretically, it could have been a trap. However, Philby reassured himself that his colleagues did not have enough evidence and proceeded to return to his homeland. The conversation at MI5 turned out to be more of a friendly chat. Over tea and cigars, they simply discussed McLean and Burgess, their friendship and relationships with Philby. However, this was not the end of the interrogations. The CIA analysed the situation with the escape of the British diplomats, data from decrypted messages, as well as Philby's entire career biography, and concluded that he was a Soviet agent. In brief, the CIA report listed all the same arguments that Philby himself had considered when he decided not to flee to the USSR. That is, all the facts together looked suspicious, but at the same time did not prove his guilt. Philby was called for a second conversation at MI5. They had received the CIA report, and this meeting was not as friendly. Philby was thoroughly interrogated about his biography, starting from his university days up through his work in Spain. After the meeting, he left with the full realization that he was considered a suspect. Judging by the fact that he was still at liberty, Michigan, 5 did not have enough evidence for an indictment, but enough to secure his dismissal from MI6. After this, there were several more rounds of questioning, each harsher than the last. Philby understood that MI5, lacking factual evidence, was trying to extract a confession from him. However, Agent Stanley was well aware of one of the main rules of a spy: whatever happens, deny all accusations. Despite the fact that many in Philby's home service, Michigan, 6, believed in his innocence, the pressure from MI5 and the CIA forced the leadership to dismiss the employee. Gradually, Philby started facing serious financial problems. He and Aileen had 5 children, which significantly complicated the situation. For the next few years, Philby survived solely on the support of friends, the main one being Nicholas Elliott. He was absolutely convinced of Kim's innocence. Friends helped Philby with money and, whenever possible, offered odd jobs. In the most difficult moments of despair, the Soviet spy contemplated activating an exfiltration plan to the USSR. However, he understood that he was constantly being watched, and his phone was tapped, making escape impossible. Several years passed after Philby's dismissal from MI6. He remained free. Moreover, It seemed that the clouds were beginning to clear. MI5 evidently still lacked sufficient evidence of guilt, and the investigation had stalled over the years. Meanwhile, MI6 continued to believe in the former agent's innocence. They organized a new interrogation of Philby. No tough questions were asked, and superficial answers were satisfactory. Kim Philby was on the way to not only restoring his reputation, but also regaining a position in MI6. However, one morning in late October 1955, Philby and his family were awakened by noise near their home. From the window, they saw a large group of reporters. On the eve, a major article about the escaped Burgess and McLean had been published in the American press. A year prior, a Soviet defector had revealed that there was another Soviet spy within British intelligence who had assisted the diplomats in their escape. The source did not know the spy's name and referred to him with the mysterious phrase, "the third man." An article that appeared the day before in America claimed that this third man was none other than Kim Philby. All these years from the beginning of the investigation, no one outside the intelligence services knew about the case against Philby. Now, the entire country suspected him of espionage for the USSR. The press publications reached the highest levels of British authority. One member of Parliament publicly addressed the Prime Minister with a question about the spy Kim Philby. Harold Macmillan, who was the head of the Foreign Office at that time, had to respond. His answer was largely based on information provided by Philby's loyal MI6 colleagues. In short, Macmillan rejected all accusations and stated that there was no evidence indicating that Philby had ever acted against Britain's interests. After such public support, Philby, on Elliott's advice, decided to hammer the final nail into the public coffin of his opponents. He gave a press conference. During the conference, Philby denied all allegations against him. He claimed he was not the third man, that he did not participate in McLean and Burgess's escape, and that he never knew Burgess was a communist. When asked if Philby himself had ever been associated with communists, he gave the following response. "The last time I spoke to a communist, knowing that he was a communist, was sometime in 1934. A masterful answer. Philby, on one hand, slightly sidestepped the question, while on the other he clearly indicated that he was not a communist. He also hinted at his youthful interest in communism, which was already known, while assuring that all this was, of course, in the past. Unsurprisingly, as a result of the press conference, the newspapers sided with Philby and described him as an honest man unjustly suspected. The American newspaper had no proof that the third man was Kim Philby. The Member of Parliament who had accused him publicly admitted his mistake. Thanks primarily to the efforts of his friend Nicholas Elliott, Kim Philby was re-employed by MI6. The phoenix officially rose from the ashes. Kim Philby was given a chance to start anew. Of course, after everything that had happened, he could scarcely become a full-fledged MI6 officer again, but a suitable position was found nonetheless. The Foreign Intelligence Service actively used journalists worldwide as their agents. Journalists had access to resources and decision-makers, and it was unlikely that anyone would suspect an overly inquisitive journalist. After all, it was their job. Kim Philby was sent to Beirut. The Middle East was a familiar region for him. Philby's father had spent much of his life there. For a long time, he was an advisor to the Saudi monarch, had a good command of Arabic, and was living in Beirut in the mid-1950s. Philby was excited about the opportunity to start anew. He went to his new workplace alone. The marriage with Eileen had long existed only on paper, not least due to his wife's mental problems. She had been repeatedly committed to psychiatric hospitals. During the scandal surrounding the investigation, Eileen herself suspected her husband of treason. However, few took her words seriously. In those days, the Middle East was an extremely interesting place for both a journalist and a spy. It was also one of the fronts of the Cold War, where Western countries and the USSR were advancing their interests. Philby quickly established contacts in his new location. He wrote articles as a freelancer for several British newspapers while simultaneously passing information to MI6 that might interest them. The agent did not report any super-secret or breakthrough data, but it seemed that overall London was satisfied with his work. One day, a well-built young man approached Philby in a restaurant and introduced himself as a representative of the Soviet trade mission. He offered Kim to meet and discuss the markets of Arab countries. It didn't take a genius to understand who this person was and what he truly wanted. At that moment, Philby could have simply refused. He would have continued enjoying life, lazily penning articles and supplying MI6 with second-rate information. However, to some extent, the espionage life was an addiction, and Kim Philby was not about to quit. A few months later, news came from London about the death of Eileen Philby, the official cause being heart problems. There were theories that her husband might have been involved, but there was no serious evidence to support this. Most likely the cause was the mental issues that Eileen drowned with large amounts of alcohol. Towards the end of her life, she and Kim had nearly stopped communicating. The fact of his wife's death did not greatly upset Philby. He was living one of the best periods of his life. He wrote a little for the newspapers, gathered some information for MI6 and did a bit of spying for the USSR. This was enough to once again feel the sweet scent of risk, yet without experiencing nervous strain. After all, the information Philby provided to the KGB now hardly contained anything valuable. There was no reason to believe that at the time anyone in the British services seriously suspected Philby. He was obviously not followed, as he regularly met with his Soviet handler. If Philby came out onto the balcony of his apartment with a newspaper, it signaled to the handler that he was ready for a routine meeting to share information. If Philby held a book in his hands, it meant the situation was serious and urgent contact was required. Philby's life at that time was so calm that he wasn't often seen on the balcony and exclusively with a newspaper in hand. Then Philby remarried, this time to an American woman. Meanwhile, his best friend Nicholas Elliott was appointed head of MI6 in Beirut. After a long hiatus, old friends were again working in the same area. Nicholas Elliott had a serious task ahead. He needed to convince one of MI6's officers in Beirut to return to London, but in such a way that the officer would suspect nothing. Not long before, thanks to a Soviet defector, British intelligence had uncovered a Soviet agent within their ranks. This turned out to be George Blake. The officer had given the KGB the names of 400 British agents, primarily in Germany. When he was exposed, Blake was working in Beirut. The British were 90% certain of his guilt. They needed to lure Blake to London for questioning. However, a sudden summons could arouse the traitor's suspicions and prompt him to flee. Elliott executed the operation flawlessly. Blake, suspecting nothing, travelled to London where he was arrested, and after questioning, he confessed to working for the KGB. Blake received a staggering sentence, a 42-year prison term. But it wasn't only the sentence that terrified the Soviet agent Stanley. If Blake had been betrayed by a Soviet intelligence source, then even Philby was at risk. In the spring of '62, Anatoly Golitsyn defected to the CIA, a KGB officer in Finland. Among other things, he revealed about a ring of 5 spies in British intelligence who had been recruited back in their university days and had been passing information to Soviet intelligence for many years. Golitsyn didn't know the names, but given the circumstances of the investigation surrounding Philby, it couldn't help but arouse suspicions. A few months later, a former MI6 officer met with his acquaintance named Flora Solomon. During their conversation, she casually mentioned that 30 years ago a young Kim Philby had attempted to recruit her to work for the Soviet Union. Solomon was not an insignificant figure in Kim's life, as she was the one who introduced him to his wife, Eileen. British intelligence resumed their investigation into Philby. They faced the same problem as before, a lack of direct evidence. A confession from the spy himself was necessary. It was hard to find a better candidate for conducting the interrogation than Nicholas Elliott. Given the new data that had come to light, Philby's best friend was now convinced that for the past 30 years he had been a Soviet spy. Kim Philby seemingly suspected that he was close to being caught. He started to become very nervous and drank even more. Acquaintances noted his trembling hands during meetings. Nicholas Elliott invited himself over to Philby's place. Everything appeared like another friendly meeting over tea and cigars. However, behind the walls sat British intelligence officers recording the conversation. Elliot needed Philby's confession that he was a Soviet spy. Philby, in turn, also suspected that this was the true purpose of the meeting. Elliot quickly moved to the main topic of conversation, stating that they knew about Philby's work for Soviet intelligence. Elliot decided to bluff and told his friend that they had irrefutable evidence in the form of defector testimonies that named him. In reality, this was not the case, which was the main reason for the meeting. Regardless, Elliot offered his friend a deal. He provided information about his cooperation with the USSR as well as KGB secrets that he knew. In return, he received immunity from prosecution and would be able to return to his homeland, and no details of the case would be leaked to the press. Philby replied that he needed time to think. Eventually, Kim Philby confessed to working for the USSR. However, his testimony was highly fragmented. He recounted how he was recruited, how he helped McLean and Burgess escape, and the names of his old handlers. However, he did not reveal any new information about current KGB employees or operations. For instance, he completely denied Anthony Blunt's involvement with the Cambridge Five. At that time, Blunt was living and working peacefully in Britain and was considered a highly reputable art historian. No one suspected that he was a secret spy for the USSR. It remains unclear why Philby confessed to Elliot. Even considering that he gave highly censored testimony, it could still be considered an admission. Perhaps Philby was stalling for time, contemplating whether to accept the deal or flee. He was releasing information little by little, thus forcing Elliot to schedule new meetings. What happened next is still a matter of debate. After several meetings with Philby, Nicholas Elliot left Beirut, allegedly for business in Africa. He assured his friend that the interrogations were not over and that soon he would have more meetings with intelligence representatives. For some reason, after Elliot's departure, no phone taps were placed on Philby's phones and no surveillance was organized on him. This was either incredibly foolish or incredibly clever. The next evening, Philby stood on the balcony with a book. The Soviet intelligence saw the signal from their agent, and soon the exfiltration began. Philby casually put on a coat, took no belongings, and told his wife he would return by evening. However, this did not happen. That same night, a Soviet cargo ship with Kim Philby on board set course for the shores of the USSR. A month later, the press learned about Philby's escape. British intelligence could not hide the information for long about a Soviet spy who had worked for MI6 for decades and had now slipped away right under their noses. Panic erupted not only within MI5 and MI6, but also across the ocean. The CIA immediately began reviewing Philby's work archives in America to understand what secrets he knew. By that time, Philby was already living in Moscow, just like his comrades from the Cambridge network, McLean and Burgess. Philby received Soviet citizenship, Soviet newspapers wrote about him, and thus a myth was born in the USSR of a super spy who outwitted Western intelligence for 30 years. This was partly true, but the lack of many details left the story far from complete. The main question remains how Philby managed to escape from Beirut and why the British did not surveil him after his confessions. The version considered true by many, including former Soviet handler of Philby Yuri Modin, is that Philby was allowed to escape. In this way, the British obtained his confession while avoiding a huge scandal that would have ensued from Philby's trial. The trial would have been an absolute humiliation for the kingdom's intelligence services. When Nicholas Elliot was asked about this, he skillfully dodged the question for the next 30 years like a true spy and took the secret to the grave with him. The Soviet official standpoint, of course, was that Philby's escape was a masterfully executed operation. Either way, Philby was received with honors in Moscow. He was given a luxurious by Soviet standards apartment in Moscow and an excellent salary. The Soviet authorities even sponsored his children who remained in Britain. 6 months later, Nicholas Elliot read a strange letter someone had left in his mailbox. He immediately recognized Philby's handwriting. In the text, the author mentioned that he could not stop thinking that Elliot let him go, apologized for the troubles caused, and suggested meeting somewhere in Berlin or Helsinki. Elliot replied with a brief message, "Lay flowers on Volkov's grave." This was a hint at the Soviet defector executed due to Philby's information. Upon reaching the Soviet Union, Kim Philby found himself in a peculiar position. On the one hand, in the USSR, he was showered with honors and money. On the other hand, after his arrival, he was given no official position within the KGB. There could have been several reasons for this. Firstly, to Moscow, he no longer represented significant interest. Secondly, there likely was a lack of complete trust in him. Apparently, there were questions in Moscow as well about how he managed to escape from Beirut. Kim Philby was not very fond of Moscow. His American wife, after several letters from her husband from the USSR pleading her to join him, eventually decided to do so, despite Elliot's dissuasion. The idyllic family life did not last long. A year later, the wife returned to America. Guy Burgess died almost immediately after Philby's arrival in the USSR. The only person from the Cambridge network with whom he maintained relations was Donald MacLean, who also lived in Moscow. During the Cold War, Philby was actively used for propaganda by both sides. In the USSR, he was a super spy and a staunch communist fighter. In the West, they depicted him as a depressive alcoholic who, because of this, decided to betray his country. As is often the case, the truth was somewhere in the middle. Despite calling the USSR his true homeland, Philby read the Times newspaper till the end of his life, which was delivered to him a week after publication, listened to BBC radio, drank Scotch whisky, and ate English jam. In the 1970s, Philby married a Russian woman, was invited by the KGB to lecture for future officers, and was awarded the Order of Lenin for his merits. In May 1988, Kim Philby died and was buried with honors at a cemetery in Moscow.